it says representative, but you're Senator Schachner.
Yep, here.
Okay. Representative Rohrcast.
Here.
Representative Stuck.
Here.
Senator Tiffany.
Here.
Nancy Dressel.
Here.
Stephen Dykstra.
Here.
Donna Hetmenik.
Here.
Ann Malone.
Here.
Brenda Warren.
Here.
Michael Weber.
Here.
And I would just remind everyone, before I turn it over to the opening remarks by Joint Legislative Council, to silence your phones, and also know that WisconsinEye is in the room. That's our version of C-SPAN here, only cooler than C-SPAN. And if you're sitting
All right, good morning, everyone, and let me start by saying thank you for all the committee members and your willingness to serve and taking the time to drive down here today. It's nice, we had a lot of applicants, so you were selected from a long list of people, so I truly appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to come down here. I am State Representative Rob Brooks. I'm the Assistant Majority Leader in the Assembly and also the co-chair, along with my colleague Senator Roth, for the entire Legislative Council study. The Council Committee is made up of legislative leadership from both sides of the aisle. Senator Roth and I, as the chairs, are selected with the task of choosing the different topics and also the membership of the committees. This session, we had over 50 different ideas and topics that were put before us. We were able to narrow that list down to about 10 study topics, and that was not an easy task in itself. We felt this was an important topic, so this group made the cut. The committee scope for this group will focus on identification and treatment of dyslexia in K through 12. It is crucial to strive for early identification and management, tactics that best serve our students to ensure that they will not only succeed in the academic environment, but beyond K through 12. Studies have estimated that dyslexia affects 10 to 20% of our students. Oftentimes, students struggle with dyslexia for years beyond being diagnosed. Like I said, Senator Roth and I received numerous phone calls, emails, office visits from parents and advocates, and that's why you guys made the cut here. So we literally probably received more phone calls and more requests for this committee than any other. So, and as you can tell by the audience out here, topic has a lot of interest. So one of the things that I will ask is that while the audience maybe was not selected to serve on the committee, I would ask that you reach out during your breaks and take feedback from everyone here, you know, so that you take all those opinions into consideration. Representative Culp, I heard that you have a ability to get emails through the committee, correct? To take those written statements in, and there will be opportunities for testimony as well. We did limit the committee size to 9 to 15 members, as we find, based on our experience and Director Anderson's suggestion, that does work the best. Let's see here. We had a long list of colleagues from both the Senate side and the representative side, the Assembly side, to request to chair these committees. We ultimately decided on Chairman Culp. He actually recognized the impact that dyslexia has on students. He had multiple conversations with us and families of dyslexic students. And his passion to find solutions to better identify dyslexia and provide treatment to all those students led us to select him as chairman of this committee. And I think you're going to find him to be a terrific proponent of this. And also Vice Chair Schachner, while she hasn't been with us long, obviously ran on her passion for education, so we thought she would be an additional, a great addition to the committee. So thank you as well for serving. Just for information purposes, committee recommendations, whatever you come up with for proposed legislation, will then come back to the Joint Legislative Council for review and a vote, and then we'll go forward to the full legislation at some point. That does not come from Representative Culp or Senator Shackner or any individual. It comes from the entire legislative council, which again is made up of all the legislative leadership. So there's a good chance that that can get passed. So we really want you to be thoughtful in that process and understand that that's going to come forward from a broad bipartisan group of legislators. So keep that in mind throughout the process. My only rule, and that of Director Anderson, is that you must be present to vote. You can't do it through a proxy or a mail-in ballot, although the final is going to probably be a mail-in, correct?
Can be.
If
Yes.
necessary. So you can't vote by phone. You have to be in attendance for that final vote. You'll have periodic votes throughout the process. It's important that you try and be here for those. If you can't, it's always, I tell people, send somebody to sit in the audience to, take notes and listen and report back to you if you can't be here for some reason. Okay, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Director Anderson. Go ahead.
Thank you, Representative Brooks. And let me give my welcome again to all of you, and thanks for your service now that the legislative members have joined us. Earlier this morning, the leadership of the committee, along with the public members and myself, had a discussion about some of the organization and history of the Legislative Council. I also want to take this opportunity again to introduce, now that the legislators have joined us, the members of the staff that will be working with you closely on this committee. You met Jessica Olzap, senior staff attorney, who will be with the committee, and Julia Norsetter, a staff attorney in our office, both of whom's services will be available to you. Tracy Young is right behind me, I believe, and Tracy is the support staff person assigned to the committee and will be communicating with you by email, getting the documents to you, also maintaining your page on our Ledge Council website so that the information that is distributed at the committees is available to yourselves and to members of the public. Also, I have two other members of the staff that are here at the beginning of the meeting this morning. I'd ask them to stand. Jessica Carls-Rupplinger is the Deputy Director of the Ledge Council, and Rachel Letzing is one of our principal staff attorneys. The two of them have been overseeing the organization of the entire interim this year and working closely with the co-chairs in getting the committees set up. And so they will be monitoring the work not just of this committee, but of the other committees as well. So again, let us know if you have any questions. We are more than happy to assist and answer them for you. Thank you again.
Okay. And I also want to point out, obviously the legislators are aware of this, but for the audience members and the members of the committee, as Director Anderson said, his staff does an exceptional job. The Legislative Council office is a nonpartisan group, so don't think that there's a bias there. They do a fantastic job. They write all of our legislation throughout the session. You will find them extremely receptive, extremely cooperative, and just first class. And I can't say that enough. We say that all the time, that they're nonpartisan in this building, but I can tell you, based on my experience, there's no better group to help throughout this process, and I just want to thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
You can give me that $1 later.
Yeah, I will.
Thank you, and one more housekeeping thing that I forgot to mention is that you have green buttons, committee members' green buttons. Push that when you speak or when you ask questions, and as the case will be here, that way it will be on WisconsinEye. I failed to do that the first time around. I'm really excited to be here as well. And thanks to the Joint Council for choosing this topic. As you indicated, Representative Brooks, there was a lot of interest in this, and Senator Roth had shared that with me as well. There was more public interest on this than on others. So, that lends a degree of gravity, I suppose, to what we want to do here. And I just wanted to also talk about the Nonpartisan Ledge Council and their professionalism, to echo what Representative Brooks said. I indicated to the people here at the orientation that they ran some numbers for me. And last session, there were 367 bills that Governor Walker signed into law, and 84.74% of that, so round it to 85%, were unanimous. So that means that more often than not, we do tend to get agreement down here. The news takes the 15% where we have disagreement on, turns it into 100% of the news story. And I'm very aware of the fact that there are different approaches to what we're looking to do here today. And I'm hoping that we will have a committee that is, hopefully I as a chair and Senator Schottner as vice chair, will have a relaxed and yet focused approach to this. And I would just point to, and I'm not going to read the scope study, but I think all of you have that, or it can be made available to you if you don't. But that is the parameters and the fences within which we're working. If there's something beyond that is needs to be brought up, certainly we can do that. But I think this is a very inclusive and detailed scope statement. We would actually have to vote on an expansion of the scope statement, and in order to and then have the 22-member committee that Representative Brooks and Senator Roth chair and co-chair, we'd have to have them vote on it. I think the reason this is a big deal is because there's nothing likely quite as frustrating to a parent as having their kids be left behind or somehow slip through the cracks. And I think that is, again, why we're here. And I think that we'll be looking at ways of early screening, evidence-based instructional materials, educator training. That's kind of the broad framework. And all of that, of course, needs to be effective. So, I'd encourage the committee members to ask what's working, what isn't working. Obviously, we're going to have experts come up here that are testifying. We're going to learn about brain chemistry and a lot of fun things like that, and I am really looking forward to it. So the goal of the committee here is, as you heard, to develop legislation to hopefully be included in next year's legislative topics. Just introductions, I think, first would be in order. I'm State Representative Bob Culp. I'm from the central Wisconsin area, Stratford. And if we would go around, let's start with Senator Schottner. And you may have some comments if you care to. And then if we could, just because of time, I'd ask that the other committee members just basically name and where you're from and maybe a sentence or so.
I'm Senator Schottner. I'm from District 10, which encompasses part of Dunn County, part of Pierce County, St. Croix County, part of Polk County, and part of Burnett County. I'm really excited about being on this committee. Education and literacy are a passion of mine. I have 2 children that did struggle with dyslexia, but I'm very proud of the fact that one is now a teacher and one is in the Navy. So they're with the right evidence and right programs, and if the goal is impact, then how are we going to make the best impact in our decisions? We will go forward. So I look forward to working with you all.
Yes.
I'm Jessica Ozelp. As my director said, I work with the Wisconsin Legislative Council.
I'm Brenda Warren. I'm from Green Bay. I'm president of the school board, also parent of a child with dyslexia. I'm a pediatrician, and I'm also defending a dissertation next week looking at barriers that prevent scientifically based reading instruction from impacting classroom practice.
Good morning. I'm State Representative Mike Rorcast from the 55th Assembly District. That's primarily the Neenah area. I'm very much looking forward to this. A number of constituents had contacted me regarding this, and anything that we can do to improve the learning of our children is extremely important to both the short and the long-term success of our state. So glad to be here. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ann Malone. I live in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm a speech and language pathologist by training. I learned about dyslexia due to a stepdaughter with dyslexia who wasn't reading in 3rd grade, and I couldn't figure out why. And I was trained at Children's Dyslexia Center here in Madison as a tutor, then an advanced tutor, then a supervisor, then a trainer of tutors, and director. I'm a retired director. It has been a journey. I don't know why I didn't know about this when I came out of the University of Madison, Wisconsin. And I just think it's fabulous that we have the study committee established. And thanks to Jen Kelly and Cheryl Ward and Pam Heidi, who have been my mentors along the way. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Michael Weber, Superintendent of Port Washington Saukville School District. I've had a passion for children and especially children who struggle for my entire educational career. And my mission is helping others get better because even a small improvement makes a big difference. Thank you.
I'm Steve Dykstra. I'm a psychologist from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In years of practice in evaluating thousands of children, I'm struck by the fact that a very large percentage, the majority of the children who seem to be struggling the most, for them, school struggles and reading struggles are almost always a part of it.
I'm Representative Amanda Stuck. I represent Appleton and Menasha in the State Assembly. No personal experience with dyslexia at all, but I certainly have heard a lot from people in the community, constituents, about their concerns about this issue and just about the process of getting evaluated and getting help in schools. So just interested to learn more and see how we can do better by our students.
Good morning. My name is Nancy Dressel, and I'm currently an instructional coach in the Hudson School District. I've worked in public education for 18 years. It wasn't until I was 38 and had a daughter who struggled with dyslexia that I discovered that I have dyslexia. And it took many years through some really challenging processes to be identified, and we continue to struggle having the public schools even put that name within their school record and provide appropriate accommodations. And so I'm really thrilled that this topic is coming forth, and can't wait to see what we do to serve the many students in our state who don't qualify for special education, but aren't having the opportunities to reach their full potential within the public school system. Thank you.
Tom Tiffany, I'm a state senator from up in the Northwoods of Wisconsin. This is one of the few issues that would get me to Madison in the middle of summer on a Monday. It is great to be here.
Hi, my name's Donna Heitmanek. I am a former special education reading specialist of 41 years as I retired in June. I'm super excited to be here because of my passion for identification of dyslexia and how it can be better served in the schools where we really don't recognize it. Thank you.
I'm Julia Norsetter, and I work for the Wisconsin Legislative Council under Director Anderson. Thank you.
And with that, I think we are ready for the presentation by the Legislative Council committee staff. Who is going to head that
Yes,
up?
I'll begin.
Excellent.
Good morning again. So Julia and I, as our director made reference, are here to provide the committee with nonpartisan legal research and advising to help develop any proposals that the committee wishes to pursue to change Wisconsin law. And we've also had reference by the chair to the scope of the committee's charge. I just want to reference a couple things. It includes reviewing current protocols for screening and identification of dyslexia in Wisconsin schools. It includes studying best practices from wherever we find them, and it includes developing legislation to improve the identification and management of dyslexia in K-12 schools, especially the early grades. So to that end, we're going to very briefly cover the material in the memorandum we distributed to the committee and posted on our committee website. It's titled Wisconsin Law and Other States' Law Relating to Dyslexia. I'll talk about Wisconsin and federal laws, and Julia will talk about laws in other states. And it's just a very, very quick overview of current law. So Wisconsin statutes cover literacy screening for reading difficulties. They have provisions for reading interventions in schools, and of course there are special education laws regarding services. Several years ago, the Wisconsin Read to Lead Task Force did extensive work resulting in a package of changes to Wisconsin elementary education laws. And you can see our office's information memorandum, which is also on our website and in the materials for today's meeting. It's titled Education Reform Legislation. It describes the changes made in 2011 Wisconsin Act 166. One major new initiative enacted at that time was universal literacy screening in kindergarten. So since 2011, the legislature has extended the requirement to other grades to have children tested every year. First, it expanded to include 4-year-old kindergarten, 5-year-old kindergarten, and first grade. And then it expanded so that it now includes second grade. So current Wisconsin law requires every school district or charter school to administer a yearly literacy screening test to students from 4-year-old kindergarten through second grade. Initially, the Department of Public Instruction, DPI, selected the screener. So they selected PALS, and the PALS was the required screener statewide in every school from 2012 to 2016. As of the 2016-17 school year, schools now select, each school board or charter school selects their screener to meet this requirement. Next, I'm going to go over the laws requiring certain reading interventions or remedial reading services when a student's test score indicates a reading difficulty risk. So the interventions or services, according to Wisconsin laws, have to be scientifically based and have to address all deficient areas in a manner consistent with the state standards in reading and language arts. Beyond that, local school boards make decisions about what that will be. Not every child who requires reading interventions will require special education services, but there is, of course, overlap. So I'll just quickly address special education laws. Both state and federal law require special education and related services for children with disabilities in public schools. When a determination is made that a child needs special education services, which is not completely the same as the process for reading interventions, but when a special education determination is made, at that point an individualized education plan, which is known as an IEP, is formulated to identify the appropriate services needed. So one category of disability that entitles a child under the law to services is a specific learning disability, and this is defined in both state and federal regulations to include dyslexia. The federal IDEA and Rehab Act require qualified students with disabilities to receive aids and services designed to meet their individual education needs. And so that's a very large area of law. I just want to stop there for now, but I'll turn it over to Julia to introduce some related laws in other states.
So as we begin examining what to do here in the state of Wisconsin, it can be helpful to reflect on what other states have done and kind of look at perhaps what's worked and what hasn't. So approximately 40 states have laws that address dyslexia and education. Our review indicated that state laws vary in terms of their prescriptiveness for what they require of school districts. The least prescriptive laws may provide for a pilot program, an advisory group, or perhaps define the term dyslexia in state statutes or administrative rules. For example, in 2014, Pennsylvania enacted a pilot program that requires school districts to screen for early reading deficiencies and provide a multi-tier system of support with interventions and parent involvement. The Pennsylvania Department of Education self-reported significant progress over pretest scores in a reading test that they administered both 1 and 2 years after the pilot program was enacted. In addition, in 2015, Utah enacted a pilot program to provide early identification and interventions. This legislation also provided for third-party evaluation of the program to see whether it helps with special education costs and whether it improves reading outcomes. Although school districts have been selected for this pilot program, there have not been any reports on its efficacy just yet. Moderately prescriptive legislation has required schools to provide reading assessments and interventions, but it hasn't mandated that school districts use certain tools. For example, in 2018, Minnesota enacted legislation that requires school districts to provide reading interventions, but hasn't specified which tools it must use. The Minnesota statutes state that interventions may include, but are not limited to, requiring attendance at summer school, intensified reading instruction, and extended day programs. In addition, in 2015, Minnesota created a publication intended for parents and educators to help them with students who are struggling with reading and navigating the school system. This publication has information for parents about what the school districts provide, as well as frequently asked questions. The most prescriptive legislation has required school districts to use specific screening, intervention, and teacher training tools. In 2015, for example, Nevada enacted legislation that requires school districts to use screening assessments that include phonetic awareness, sound symbol recognition, alphabet knowledge, decoding skills, rapid renaming skills, and encoding skills. I have contacted the relevant departments of education to see what the reports are about the efficacy of their various programs, and will share my findings with the full committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, I think we're ready to go to the first people on the docket. Did you, Dr. Gosey and Dr. Gustafson, did you want to come up together, or? Yes. Okay, excellent. You're together on the screen, so this is wonderful. Welcome. Thanks for coming in this morning, and we are anxiously awaiting your testimony.
Okay. So we just click. Gotcha. Okay.
And I don't know if you have your mics on. I tend to forget my mic an awful lot.
Do we need to leave them on
Yes.
when we're speaking the whole time? Just, they stay on? Okay. Hi, I am Julie Gosey. I am also very happy to be here today and very happy that this is being addressed. I felt like after I heard the introductions that I was a little bit relieved, because I feel like a lot of the things that I plan to cover, you all have already brought up and mentioned, so that seems like, I hope there are some new things that we talk about, but that we're sort of, a lot of us are on the same track here as far as the concerns, at least. So I'm coming in as somebody who brings some different perspectives, I hope. I am a mom. I have 3 kids. 2 of my boys have dyslexia, so we have gone sort of through the journey that people talk about. I'm also a pediatrician and do not feel like, as the speech and language pathologist said, I was trained to really help families with this until I had to figure it out for my own son. I'm also on faculty at the medical school in pediatrics. I'm working on a doctorate much farther behind what Dr. Warren is at this point, but I'm also interested in how schools and health systems do or don't always work together very well for students. And then the other, I guess, piece that I bring in is as a parent advocate. Another parent and I started a group in 2006 in Verona, a small group for parents and teachers that was sort of a support and information group, because we both felt like there's all this great science and information about what could be helping our kids and it's not available to them. So what can we do about this? So it was very helpful for us to meet and just get to know other parents that were kind of going through the same struggles. In fact, that's how I met Dr. Gustafson, as he was a speaker at our group years ago. So I will turn it over to him. Do you want this? There you go.
My name's Dan Gustafson. Again, I'm very pleased to be here. I myself am dyslexic, and part of what I've had the fire in the belly for a long time about how to help other people as I was helped. This was part of why I became a psychologist. One of my interests has been to work on diagnostic issues in a clinical capacity, but I've also had the good fortune to work through the Dean Foundation and now Arnold School on creating a clinic that is geared toward helping children who are struggling with reading. Part of our focus has been to collaborate with Marianne Wolf, who created that RAN-RAS measure that was mentioned as a required component of the Nevada screening. And so we're interested in subtypes of dyslexia and how do we best individualize instruction for needs of learners, as opposed to saying, here we are, this one school that has this one approach.
So I'll start with a little overview of what we're going to talk about today. We are going to focus a lot on reading in general, because that's really the way to help kids with dyslexia, is to understand how it all fits together. We'll go over some of the stats for Wisconsin, and people have sort of alluded to the fact that things could be better. We're going to talk a little bit about effective reading instruction, some specific key points about dyslexia, touch on the scientific imaging, the brain imaging that's really exciting and hopeful. I think frustration was mentioned a few different times, and I remember feeling very frustrated at times, but I also, part of the frustration comes from knowing that there is a better way to do this, maybe not prescriptive in great detail, but there is a lot of hope that kids with dyslexia can learn to read adequately if we are willing to make the difference and as Dan said, help in a way that fits what they need. And then finally, just kind of talking about using reading science in a way that would help identify and manage dyslexia, which is the goal of this committee, also noting that not everybody will make the cut, I guess, for having a severe enough disability to have special education. There are different levels of dyslexia that we need to address all of those levels. So we'll touch a little bit on response to intervention and special education and the difference, and then also kind of how core curriculum, screening and assessment, and teacher training will play into this. So again, I feel like a lot of the comments were already made. And Dan and I decided to talk briefly about several topics, knowing that we're going to have Dr. Seidenberg, who's a scientist with brain imaging. Different people are going to come and tell this, so we wanted to kind of lay the foundation for how all the parts may fit together. So if we talk about reading, what are the stakes for Wisconsin? There are a lot of problems if people cannot learn to read, which we're all aware of. One is just the unmet potential, not being able to achieve. And as a mom, the thought of any of my kids not being able to read was devastating. So that's sort of how the journey started, was out of wanting to make sure I did everything I could. Learning disability by definition means not achieving as expected. There's kind of some parts that are just not able to achieve as we would expect, and sometimes the unmet potential is due to the curriculum, and those curriculum casualties also struggle, but maybe for slightly different underlying reasons. Also, if you're interested in the financial cost, even just thinking about low health literacy and being able to understand prescriptions, directions, make appointments, those sort of things, these older numbers estimated $3.5 to $7.5 billion annually lost in Wisconsin because of people not being able to read and understand information from their physicians. And then I threw in a quote from our state superintendent, Tony Evers, that he said, "We cannot afford to leave large numbers of our students behind their peers and expect the Wisconsin economy to continue without disruption. It's costing us to not be proactive with this." So I'm, again, happy that we're talking about this. It's important to notice that there are stereotypes about dyslexia, but it does impact students from all racial, ethnic, economic, and education levels. It's the outcomes that vary a lot. What does that do to a child's life? So kids like Dr. Gustafson and my kids that get a lot of extra help that's privately paid for can learn to read, and it's not so disabling. Kids who don't have that access, if it's not provided in public school, miss out on that opportunity and are at risk for a lot of problems, which I will touch just very briefly on. One thing in general is just not being able to read well enough to gain exposure to vocabulary, to content knowledge, just to learn science and social studies, and those things requires reading, especially as kids get older, and also just higher risk for teen pregnancy, substance abuse, anxiety, depression, suicide, school failure, and just poor health comes throughout life. But the positive thing that I want to make sure I mention is just that with the effective intervention, at least that would allow them to have the opportunity to realize their potential. So a lot of what I talk about, I think, ends up seeming negative or not very positive at all, but the point of it is that it can get better. And then I have, this is Maggie Alderin Pocock, who is an astrophysics PhD who has dyslexia and didn't understand it until she was quite later in her education, but really struggled with reading, but had a super great talent for science. And so I just wanted to remind myself again that if kids get access and support, they can do just about anything they want. It's also important to just think about how not being able to read marginalizes people in our society. And we know that 85% of juvenile offenders have trouble reading, so most of them do. There are studies that show that if effective reading intervention is given while people are in the system, they have a much lower chance of returning to prison, 16% versus about 70% if they don't get any help for literacy problems. Also, we know that there's more chance of delinquency, incarceration, Students become more violent once they're in the system and more likely to violate parole if they don't have that help at some point while they're in the system. Now I'm going to come to talking about the NAEP, or National Assessment of Academic Progress scores for Wisconsin's reading performance in 2017, the most recent data we have. Only 8% of our students score at the advanced level, which is the green, 27% proficient, so that means only 35% of students are proficient or advanced in our country based on this test, which is a standardized test that is given across the country. Samples of students are taken from every state in different groups so that it's very well done as far as being able to compare apples to apples. And that leaves us with about 65% at basic or below basic on the 4th grade reading assessment that's done every year. And we can go back decades and compare year to year how this has been going for us. So it's not uncommon to see headlines that say we're holding steady, some scores are up, some scores are down, but overall we remain steady, our scores are, stable. And that's true. If we look from 1992, you can see the red line is Wisconsin, all the way till 2017, it's pretty flat line, and statistically it is not changing enough to be statistically different from year to year. But the other way of looking at the same information is that if we look at how we rank compared to other states on the same test, given the same way yearly over decades, we've fallen from 3rd in rank. So we were the 3rd best state, kind of up with Massachusetts, the blue line, in 94. And now we are ranked 34th. So we haven't done worse with our scores. We've stayed flat, but other states have done a better job. And I will get to the details of this too. The other problem that is very concerning to me as a mom and a pediatrician and just a citizen is that, again, my kids have gotten, I think, what they need. If they struggle, it won't be because they didn't have the opportunity to learn to read in life. But so many kids don't have access to that. And I do get calls from parents, kids, the Learning Difference Network, other physician colleagues, constantly saying the things that everybody here had sort of mentioned that's had experience with this, that it's very difficult to get an assessment, to get the appropriate identification, to get the appropriate answers and intervention. So it really bothers me, and I think will bother everybody in this room, that 65%, or almost 560,000 Wisconsin students, if we extrapolate from the sample to the whole enrollment of the state, would score lower than proficient on this 4th grade reading test last year. 2/3 not proficient. That's sad. Based on the 2017 results, all of the different racial, economic, and disability groups perform below the national average compared to similar groups in other states. Scores for the white students rank, and again, we're talking about rank of where we fall compared to other states, is 41st, and that even includes being below Alabama and Mississippi, some of the southern states that I think sometimes we assume we would be performing better than those states. African-American students rank 49th compared to their peers in other states. And black students in Wisconsin scored 32 points, which is about 3 grade levels lower than white students. So we have problems with reading instruction that also play in, or are played into with a lot of other discrepancies and disproportionality. So I'm gonna maybe show you a positive picture of a happy child reading. Back to reading in general. Learning to read is a process. It's developmental, and it involves learning and integrating very specific skills along the way. All students have to get these skills. There's a hierarchy, things build on each other, and they have to become more and more connected to become fluent readers with good comprehension. But because of the way dyslexic readers process information, it is much more difficult for them to build those neurological connections related to reading. And we'll get into a little bit more about why that is and how it can be impacted by some of the screening and interventions that we'll come to as well.
Can I stress that point just?
Yes.
So just to reiterate the point, what we're talking here about dyslexia, but when we're talking about dyslexia, we're talking about the cohort that's having the most difficulty learning to read, but that when we teach everybody to read more successfully, when we derive lessons about what is scientific finding that helps the people who have the most difficulty, we vastly benefit those who are also having some difficulty. So this is not, so people, as we're talking about the word dyslexia, please know that we're really talking about the welfare of the state in every respect, not a subset of our kids.
And this slide actually kind of talks basically about what he said, that reading instruction that's effective will help all of the students, whether they're struggling greatly, struggling somewhat, or even the advanced readers in some of the states that have enacted this, better reading interventions and screening programs that have worked well have improved the percentages of advanced readers as well. So it's not just the kids at the bottom that this could help, it's sort of everybody, all levels, if we could be better at that. And then just to kind of put this into perspective, it's sort of like if every kid can benefit from good nutrition, kids with, say, diabetes, it really matters a lot more, and kids who are have severe diabetes, just focusing on their diet isn't going to be enough. They're going to need more intensive things. And so reading is very similar, that everybody can have, needs to have good reading experiences and instruction. Some kids need it more than others, as far as being very crucial for them to even become adequate readers, and other ones need very, very, very intensive instruction and support to become adequate readers. Sorry, I'm stumbling over my words. So let me keep going. So there's a lot of science behind at least the 5 key components of effective reading instruction. And I'm not a teacher, so I'm not, actually Dan was, but I'm not a teacher, not here to tell people how to teach, and also not here to bash teachers at all. We've had wonderful teachers, maybe one stinker, but we've had wonderful, wonderful teachers who've been amazing at being supportive, offering good content. I've been very fortunate with all 3 of my kids as far as that sort of parts, but I don't think that, other than one who had some training, sort of like the speech pathologist talked about, didn't really understand sort of what the tutor that we were paying was doing and how to kind of make it all work together. So it wasn't that they didn't want to help or that they didn't care, because they definitely did. It was just that they didn't have some of this information to be able to incorporate some of the evidence-based instruction into the reading that they needed. So we definitely know that kids need to be taught how to break words apart, how to notice and manipulate sounds. That's that phonemic awareness that was mentioned in a screener. They need to understand that letters, those little squiggles on the page, represent sounds, and those can be blended together. We need to work on oral reading skills and make sure that kids have access to guided oral out loud reading and have fluency modeled for them. They still need to get vocabulary and background knowledge. And again, kids with dyslexia often don't have as much access to that unless they're accommodated with books on tape or other ways of getting the information while they're learning to read better. And then also comprehension strategies. So it's not that there's one piece of this that's going to make the difference. It's about individualizing what kids need and making sure they get it along the way. And I put the National Reading Panel picture because they did review over 100,000 studies several years ago, and these came out as very critical parts of reading instruction.
Could I just,
Absolutely.
so in some ways, the National Reading Panel was a parallel national group to what you all are thankfully doing here, which is that they said there's a national crisis, and they brought in a great many experts who, again, reviewed over 100,000 studies and issued that report that had to do with emphasizing we do know what good instruction is, and we need to make sure that we get it out there.
And this is intentionally repeating a little bit about what I've already said, but there are parts to reading that start out sort of separate and that kids need to learn the different skills on the end of this reading rope. Background knowledge, vocabulary, structures of language, verbal reasoning, understanding even how books work, what's upside down and right side up at the very beginning, and then also the phonological awareness, decoding, spelling, sight recognition of words. All of that needs to become increasingly automatic with practice, but it also has to build with making sure that the very basic skills that start out as separate pieces become mastered and then can become integrated more and more over time. So if a child really struggles with the phonologic awareness part of things, it makes it hard for those other pieces to layer on top very efficiently. So they may, it has been my experience that it's common to jump to, especially in older kids, kind of the comprehension piece without making sure that some of the foundational pieces are there, which is what the screening would hopefully help us do a better job with. And again, just some of the students need very precise, intensive instruction. Other kids will pick it up, but all of them will benefit from a more systematic approach. Now I'm going to switch and talk just a little bit about dyslexia. This was said by, in the introduction, that between 10 and 20, this says 10 and 17%, depending on the sample, have some degree of dyslexia. Another key point is that we can tell with about 90% accuracy whether or not a kindergartner will be in the bottom 10% of readers in second grade by looking at a few things. So vocabulary, that phonologic awareness is a huge piece early on, and then just orthographic knowledge of alphabet, naming letters, and the speed with which letters are named are all very important. And I put a crystal ball on here because if we think about it, if somebody told us that if you pick these lottery numbers, you have a 90% chance of winning, would we walk away from that? I don't think we would. I think we would want to take that on and really make sure we use that information. And the same is true. We sort of do have a crystal ball for these kids if we use the right screening tools and help people be able to integrate it in a reasonable way within a school district. Did you want to say something else? No. Okay, so more about dyslexia. This is a very big point that I hope we're making over and over. Students get most of their reading instruction in a regular education classroom. Even if they have a learning disability identified, even if they have the label of dyslexia, the majority of the time they spend in literacy instruction is going to be in that regular classroom with their regular teacher. So all teachers, not just reading specialists or special education teachers, need to understand how all of this connects together. And then I said, well, just touch on this because we have more of it this afternoon, I believe, but there's super amazing images now of reading brains in action. So kids can be given a task of like sounding things out or rhyming or different things like that. And it is clear that kids who really struggle to read have differences in the areas of the brain that light up the most and how those connections are built. And I believe I'm going to turn it over to you now.
So we have an understanding now, thanks to functional magnetic resonance imaging, of the neurosignature of successful reading. And for almost all right-handed individuals, it's going to happen on the left side of the brain. There's a conveyor belt that, if it's moving well and successfully, is going to involve seeing the word, moving into parietal areas or temporal areas where the word is being decoded, moving up to the front of the brain where meaning is derived. And for a great many people, that conveyor belt is going to move successfully. It does take a lot of reps for everybody to get the information. Relating back to some things that Julie said, some kids are going to need more help in getting that conveyor belt to move successfully. Some are going to need less. Dyslexia is certainly a major factor in the neurological explanation, as I'll show, for why some people will struggle. But other kids may have been raised in families where there's just less access to books. And those kids who get read to a lot, who got a lot of Dr. Seuss, which is classically phonemic, they got a lot of informal training along the way. But we do know that there's the subset of kids for whom dyslexia, or the neurological aspect of learning difficulty, is very clear. So dyslexia is most commonly understood in terms of a core deficit in terms of being able to do the phonemic elements of language. Second, we've come to understand through work by Marianne Wolf and some others that another big question is how efficiently does the system work? So we could think of this as almost like riding a bike. So do you understand how to do it? Are you able to balance and move the pedals? But then also, can you move quickly enough to get where you want to go? So there are people who struggle both in decoding the words, but also then that conveyor belt moves slowly and laboriously. And so when the conveyor belt moves slowly, then it's going to put other strains on us as thinkers. Like very often kids with dyslexia also have some short-term memory difficulties. So they're working hard to decode. It's a slow, laborious process, and along the line, what's getting lost is the author's intention. One of the things, though, that is really, this is looking at, again, that left hemisphere signature of what successful reading looks like. We know now from looking at a lot of dyslexic brains as they read that left hemisphere is not working as well. There is something, though, that is so striking and so exciting, which is Sally Shaywitz, for example, a neurologist at Yale, has said that good instruction can do what neurosurgeons cannot, which is that we can see now in functional magnetic resonance imaging that successful tutoring fixes the dyslexic brain. So, so we can see this is, they're looking in towards, so here's my left hemisphere. Mine probably looked like the top slide when I was much younger. And you can see that other parts of the brain, like the brain is essentially trying to figure out meaning in other ways. We've got right hemisphere involvement where it really shouldn't be. But then after successful remediation, there's that beautiful left hemisphere slide where we can see the brain is being activated in the parts that we want it to, and the brain is no longer doing as much right hemisphere work. We also know that the best intervention is early intervention. All of us probably know a family who moved to Wisconsin from a land where they spoke a foreign tongue. And the kids pick up language quickly, and the adolescents struggle a bit, and mom and dad often have a really hard time. That is because there are critical windows for language acquisition. And if we can find kids early and remediate their learning needs early, we can be tremendously successful. The amount of effort, though, that it takes both in instruction but also in effort for the person to learn just gradually increases as they age. And the tragedy is that we've had a system that's really based on what we could think of as a wait-to-fail system, where very often, and you'll still hear this said a lot, so you know, on a regular basis in my office, what happens is someone will come in and say, they were doing group reading activities, and my daughter memorized the book and would always seem like a proficient reader, and now she's in 4th grade and she cries every day when she goes to school because she can't read. So if we have a system where we wait until people are falling apart because we haven't really assessed the nature of their need early on, then what we're doing is not only putting people at really grave risk for anxiety, sadness, for feeling disenfranchised from schools, but also we're getting them past that critical window potentially where they're going to have a harder time learning, and then crucially back to those grade 4 scores for National Assessment of Educational Progress. There's a huge curriculum change that happens in 4th grade, which is that schools stop teaching reading. They start presuming that you do read successfully so as to access science, history, or even math these days with all the word problems. So we've had a system that has been broken in a great many ways. So one potentially positive thing that has come from a realization that early intervention is good intervention has been something called the response to intervention system. And the effort, which I'll spell out in some additional slides, is to say, let's look at the learner and do some quick screening to see whether they need individual or extra help, and then let's ramp up the help. And this, by the way, makes so much sense. And when I first saw response to intervention, I thought, hey, this is what we need. Let's intervene. Let's see who needs help. Let's give them help intensively. Unfortunately, the national data has not been encouraging, and you can, if you Google this in terms of response to intervention, and it's people are really struggling to understand why. What seems to be happening is that we're doing more screening, but we're not necessarily consistently doing a good enough job giving scientifically rigorous informed reading remediation. Also, what I'm seeing a lot, and you've probably heard this from your constituents, is that we've got some kids who are on a yo-yo diet of intervention now, where they get so there's an identified need, they get some help, and very often they are getting good help, and people are celebrating that child's success. Now they've come up, they're doing better. There's a difference between doing better and reaching your potential, by the way. And then people say they have progressed, so no longer do you need help. And then it's taken away, and then by the end of the year, there's a grave concern. The child is no longer doing well, is having a horrible time in school, giving help, and so we've got a lot of kids who, while response to intervention does portend good intervention if it's done well, we need to do it long enough to make sure that children really benefit. So how this is supposed to work is to say, we're going to try to do rigorous instruction for everybody to begin with. Some people are, with screening, going to be found to have individual needs, again, in that 10 to 25%. The intention then is to have them receive a pull-out intervention at a greater level of support and that it should be a scientifically based intervention. Now, we do have a problem with the word science, which is the word science, and this has been discussed at many levels, including the federal level and Department of Education. When we said we need scientifically based reading instruction, the publishers of instructional materials all of a sudden just added that word right to the back of their stuff. And I see a lot of nods. So the question of what is rigorous science, what comports to what we understand about teaching reading versus saying there is some published something financed by someone who said this was a good intervention is an issue that we all have to struggle with. So the intention was to do group work in Tier 2 very often. If a child is still struggling, then the goal is to do a different intervention or a much more rigorous intervention, more time. A problem that we're having in Wisconsin schools is very often there's not something different, there's not something more rigorous. And then the hope is that if response to intervention is done well, that we'll have, as Gieseldijk discussed, fewer curriculum casualties, fewer people who needed special education assistance because their needs have been addressed early on and they're doing well in school. Notice, by the way, under this formulation, very often the reading help is being located in this response to intervention system. A lot of families come to us and they say, please let me get my kid in special ed. Sometimes special ed isn't where the reading teachers are now. So we're thinking about it. So this is a system where everybody has a need. So what we call this, the semantics, can be a big problem. For example, I have heard many times people will say, yes, you have a reading disability. We agree you have a reading disorder, but we don't agree that it's disabling, that you have severe impairments. So what is disabling? It's not often about potential. Very often is that child failing? So we may have a child whose potential is to do exceptionally well in school, but they're able to get just enough help that they're doing okay, and then we proclaim that that child does not have a disability, and then we deny assistance that would have allowed them to reach their true potential. We need to be about unwrapping the true potential of every child in this state, not saying that we're going to do potentially the minimum that's needed to get them a little bit farther up. There are a lot of things that that teachers hear, that parents hear when a child is struggling with reading. And sometimes it is true that we need to read more at home. Sometimes it's true that a child is struggling with some motivational issues. But very often, in my work as a clinical psychologist in neuropsychology, if there is an underlying unremediated learning disability, that child is, of course, going to be anxious. That child is, of course, not going to be excited about going to school. They are going to be demoralized. Imagine what it would be like to go through life in our highly literate society not reading, surrounded by people who can. And so often what we do is we say, hey, it must be this other factor, rather than doing due diligence and saying, let's get to the bottom of this. And so often the bottom of it is reading. Yes, absolutely, thank you.
So I wanted to point out, I don't know how many times over the years parents have told me, and I was told this, I'll start again. I don't know how many times over the years I've heard this from teachers, parents, that it's often said that, well, the student doesn't see things backwards, they don't flip their letters, so it can't be dyslexia, because there's this older idea that it was all about vision and differences in glasses, and vision therapy would be the answer. However, there is a joint policy statement from the Academy of Pediatrics and several other groups that talk about the fact that vision problems can interfere with processes of learning, but just the way they see things is not the cause of learning disabilities or dyslexia. So it's not uncommon for me to get a call that, my school said they think it might be dyslexia, they have these special glasses, or they have these tinted reading overlay things that are not scientifically based, and want to try that for months sometimes, and it really causes loss of time, and this window starts to close where we could have had the most impact if people have the right information. So again, it's not that people are trying to be unhelpful. It's that's sort of a big myth, just like those other things that get sort of thrown out as a way to stop the conversation. And the other one that is a sort of pet peeve of mine is that parents are told, we don't do dyslexia, it's a medical condition. It is a brain-based condition, or it can also be environmentally triggered. Yes, thank you. But at the same time, those are just sort of ways to push back and not, it gets used as a way to sort of stop the conversation, and people come to me then and say, they said, you're the doctor, do something, and I say, I'm not trained to do that, we need to get you to somebody who can, and really, it should be stuff that's happening, a lot of it in school, so that it doesn't get to that point.
So if dozens of times I've had families say to me that they were in meetings and told that they were not allowed to use the word dyslexia, which I know sounds astounding, but the presumption was that if the word dyslexia was in the discussion, that it would have to be addressed. And schools have been very emphatic about this. Now, there have thankfully been some changes, but for a long time, the presumption was we're not even going to mention that word. So we want to know why is it that this is happening? And people are very hesitant about the reading wars. You've probably seen the long Isthmus articles about the reading wars. And one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that there has been a debate for a long time about how to teach reading. My former professor, Jean Chol, wrote a book called The Great Debate that chronicled more than 100 years of a pendulum going back and forth in the United States in terms of how to teach reading. And the arguments about phonics versus whole language methods of instruction, phonics being focused on making sure that there's a specific structure that correlates to the neurodevelopment of learning, beginning reading, that making sure that those skills are established. Whole language tends to focus more on the idea that reading can be an inferred process, that people, if they're interested enough in reading, that they will learn to read, that they can infer meaning and figure out a word as a whole as opposed to breaking it down. So there are some arguments to go back and forth about a multiplicity of potentially successful ways to teach reading. But the key thing is, what does the individual learner need? And unfortunately, when we do whole language at the beginning of a reading process, that's where curriculum casualties happen. And there are historic reasons for this. I was astounded in coming from Massachusetts to Wisconsin that the reading wars were alive and well here. And in fact, it wasn't just that they were alive and well, it was really that for some reasons historic, maybe some things about the reading recovery system. By the way, there was a big grant to the university where a lot of money was given for reading recovery, a system, by the way, that cost a huge amount of money, that trained a lot of teachers, and has now, there are studies that were done in Madison Public Schools, for example, where they radically turned their practices because they realized reading recovery just was not working. And we could go on and on about that. But rather than saying, let's make sure that we do intervention well in terms of what the learners, what they need, there has been this whole language is the way we do things. And so part of why the Wisconsin Reading Coalition was formed was to try to have some counterpoint to this other group, Wisconsin State Reading Association. And early on, we, with Representative Ripp back in 2009, worked on Assembly Bill 584, where we were trying to say, let's have some phonemic assessment of kindergartners that can be done quickly, inexpensively. Let's do this so that we can identify struggling readers right from the beginning of their schooling experience. That bill died in committee, but in the course of it, there were formal rebuttals that were given by the Wisconsin State Reading Association, and some of it up on the screen, they said, so the quotes, by the way, are sort of my representation. So they put the word dyslexia in quotes. The blue is what I think that means, that they're really kind of saying, hey, if it exists, it's not really a problem. There was this, and I'll have another slide that's going to come up. There was kind of this naysaying attitude about it, that if it's a problem, we're not even sure it's a problem. If it's a big problem, it would be hard to fix. It would cost too much money. It would involve too much assessment. And so essentially, the argument was this wasn't our responsibility to fix it, which is what has happened in our state. We have a lot of private reading tutors in our state because individual families desperate for help are getting help outside of the schools for things that are not happening within the schools, and that's just wrong.
Can I add one fact? So with my son, we paid for private tutoring 2 to 3 times a week for about 6 years. Oh, I did it again, sorry. With my oldest son, we paid for private tutoring that was systematic, and some of the things we'll get into in a little bit. But the school wouldn't allow us to do it in the school, so I had to drive to school, pick him up, drive to the senior center, which would let us be in there for free, pay the tutor, take him back to school. So he was missing class time with his peers, he was getting pulled out, but there was no other option for him to be able to learn to read. And so I also hear that all the time, that it's just a lot of extra paying, running around, investigating in order to get kids what they need. Sorry.
You could leave that on, that's right.
Okay.
So this idea that there's no agreed definition of dyslexia, this is just untrue. There are differences sometimes about how we should measure this, and progress that happens over time. If I could use a personal example, I just thankfully had a cancer that was removed from my GI tract. You may have heard there, and I got my routine screening at age 50. You may have heard experts are now saying that people should be tested at age 45. That would have been much better for me. So it's not that we're having a debate about whether cancer exists. We may have some differences around the margin about what are the numbers that might identify it, but we have national groups that are doing good scientifically based work on saying who are these kids, what do they need. So Wisconsin State Reading Association, so they said there's no agreed definition of dyslexia, not true. They said the cost of DPI of a scientifically based normative screening device would be prohibitive. Thankfully, many people in this room, advocates for kids, advocates for our kids, and with the help of legislators, there was passed Act 166, which was passed with bipartisan support, which designates that we do now screen kids for reading problems. Part of what we see, and so people sometimes, again, doubt how bad this is, but this, for example, and do you want to, this was sent to you, I think?
Mm-hmm. So about a week ago, I got a call from a parent up in Menominee, and she said I could say where the school was. She happened to be a pediatrician, so connected with me through another pediatric organization, and took a little screenshot of this handout that was sent home. And even after months of sort of trying to advocate and talk about what her daughter needed, they made this handout and sent it home. And I'll read it out loud just for emphasis. It's a little hard to see. Please, please, please do not, in bold letters, have your child sound out the words. This is more harmful than helpful. Instead, have them look for chunks of words inside the unknown word. So it's exactly the opposite about what we would want to be doing with a first grader. And that's still happening just in the last couple of months. And I get calls like that from moms that are very savvy a lot of times about maybe what should be happening that just is not happening. And it's a tough battle.
Thankfully, we do now have clarification about this issue of dyslexia being discussed, and we're thankful that that Tony Evers did release this, in which he clearly says in that second paragraph, there's nothing in state or federal law that prohibits the use of the term dyslexia or related terms. I will tell you, though, that this is still happening. So even last week, I had a child who was in my office who was having a very hard time, and the discussion was, oh, well, there may be dyslexia, but that's not that's a medical thing. So one of the things that was also accomplished of great import in Act 166, that bipartisan achievement, was that there would be a part of licensure for beginning teachers that would involve passing the foundations of reading test. And unfortunately now, and there was testimony, I was a month ago here, that DPI is proposing PI 34, a tiered licensure system, which is based in some legitimate concerns, which is let's make sure that if there are emergency situations where we cannot find a licensed professional to teach, that there is some flexibility, but that flexibility already exists under our emergency procedures. This new effort on PI 34 is really potentially undermining having our teachers learn how to teach, and it's already been happening. There have already been a great many people who have been given emergency licenses, which are then given year by year by year. And they're not supposed to be continued to be given, but they have been continued to be given. And the explanation has been, well, some people are having trouble finding teachers. Some colleges are not preparing people, they say, for to be adequately trained reading instructors. Of course, that's a problem that cries out for effort by the colleges. And then there's some teachers who have complained that they're having trouble passing. So we would like to stress strongly that making sure that teachers do understand scientifically based reading needs to happen, and we need DPI to stop cutting the legs out under us in terms of these emergency licensures and this idea that now they're going to institute or make permanent changes that undermine Act 166 is truly a travesty. So a lot of people will say, as we think about testing kids for reading problems, they'll say, hey, don't we do too much testing already? And there are people like Diane Ravitch who were involved with creating the No Child Left Behind testing that do actually have some, she looks back and says, maybe some things were done with good intention, but we went too far. One of the things that happened with No Child Left Behind is that there is a lot of high-stakes testing, but it's high stakes for the schools. It's looking at what's happening overall in a school district. It's not testing that is fast. It's not testing that's cheap. It's not testing that picks up dyslexia. So these are often computer-based tests that are very often given at the end of the year to say, how is a school district doing? They don't inform instruction. So we're talking about how does a child read? The child is not reading to that computer. And our kids who have dyslexia, if they have time, very often they can kind of figure out what might be a comprehension answer, but they don't understand, they're not reading successfully. One other thing is that when we do this testing, very often we're presenting the data to parents in really confusing statistics. And I don't know if you've had this experience, but I, as a psychologist, honestly was dumbfounded on a number of different times when I sat down with my teachers of my kids. And I asked teachers, do you understand these statistics? And they said, no, we don't. If it indicates it's a problem, then there's something that says problem. And I spent a lot of time then going home trying to figure out what the stats were and their meaning, going through different websites and textbooks. So if we're going to test, we need parents to be empowered with clear information about how is their child doing so that they can advocate for them. So another thing that we sometimes hear is that really what we need are some things called running records, or we need benchmark testing. And you will hear over and over again a teacher say, okay, it's all fine because your child has attained level, and then they'll name a letter. But there's no clear understanding of what that letter means. And very often when they do statistics on what is the reading proficiency involved with that, many of our benchmarks are extremely low. They are 16th percentile or lower. So if you went to a parent, if you sat down with a parent and said, hey, Julie, it's all fine, your child passed the benchmark, but you understood that that was the 17th percentile, you would not be okay with that. But that's really what we're doing in our schools with this benchmark system. And again, with the running records, we're doing yo-yo diets where we're going to give a little bit more help. Oh, he's doing better. Oh, he fell below the benchmark. Above, below the benchmark, not getting the help the child really needs to sustain, and not having parents understand how dire the circumstances are for their son or daughter going to school every day. So we have, as I said, some issues about inappropriate implementation of RTI. There hasn't been a good enough instruction. We haven't done enough to individualize what needs to be done for children. How dramatic this is in Wisconsin. Some of our testing, for example, you've probably heard that schools have been allowed to move off of PALS, and many schools are buying better, faster, cheaper interventions, assessments to see what kids need. But there are some really discouraging things. So, for example, I spoke to the director of the creator of the STAR test. There are two versions of STAR. There's one test that some school districts insist on that doesn't measure phonemic abilities. And then there are others that do. So, and you think, how does that happen? How would we imagine a medical test that would say, oh, we know what is going to be highly predictive of whether a person has a disease? Oh, we just don't really want that information. So we'll like that version. We want STAR Light. So that is happening in the state of Wisconsin. We need to have good assessments. We know what good assessment is. It doesn't cost a lot of money. It's stuff like Nevada's talking about, phonemic awareness. These are some examples. Rapid naming. This is a very fast test. You're naming individual letters and seeing how quickly a person can just get those up and out of their brain. Pseudo word decoding. That child who memorizes the book, if you present him or her with a word that is written like a normal word, pla, but does not in fact have any meaning, we can see very quickly whether she can decode that or not. Vocabulary. Some children will have other language processing difficulties. We can quickly do some screening for those kinds of concerns. So we have in Wisconsin Act 166 a chance to do great work, but we need to be insisting that schools use good measures and that they intervene with a child long enough and strong enough to get that child succeeding. Teachers are crying out for professional development. When I've talked to principals about this, very often they say, oh my gosh, Dan, this sounds great. How are we going to get our teachers trained? So we need to be thinking about teachers in terms of licensure. Let's make sure that they get what they need through their collegiate programs. But we also need to acknowledge that there are a lot of well-meaning teachers who are hungry for the information they need to truly advance the welfare of their students. So these are some examples of different interventions. Orton-Gillingham method is what I got growing up. It's sequential. It's looking at how do we work on some sound blends that work, or sounds that work into blends that work into higher level. Project Read is an example of an Orton kind of intervention done at a larger scale, as is the Wilson. Singerland method, again, same thing, direct instruction. You may have seen again in the Isthmus, there was a big thing about direct instruction, and some teachers actually kind of secretly doing direct instruction within their classrooms, because for a time Madison Public Schools had declared that they were doing other methods, that they were doing reading recovery, and so there have been teachers who have sought out for a long time the interventions that are going to work. Ravo is from Marianne Wolf at Tufts. She's working on this issue of automaticity. So how do I get the skill? How do I get it strong enough and automatic enough that I can do it very quickly in the course of reading? So key points. Dyslexia is common. We can clearly identify those kids in need. We can do it early. We can intervene early. Most people are going to get the help they need in their regular education program. So it is not enough to just focus on the reading specialists. We need to do good work right from the beginning, right from Tier 1. That what we have been doing, though, is unfortunately letting a lot of people fall behind. And I'd like to thank you all for letting us speak. And we have references.
Very informative for certain, and I have probably a dozen questions that I will not monopolize, because we have literally about 8 minutes until the normal time that we're going to quit. But we can also go over into the lunch hour from my perspective. There's a lot of content here. So the question I have that I want to have you answer at the end, after others from committee have a chance to ask their questions is, what would good legislation look like in a, 3 or 4 sentence type approach? But don't answer that now, think on it, and I'll open it up to anyone from the committee that has questions such as I do. Mr. Dykstra.
If you look at the graph that shows, and I don't know if you can bring it up, that shows Wisconsin's fall in ranking compared to other states, most of that decline compared to other states seemed to have occurred in the end of the last century and the beginning of the new one. Is there something that happened during that time that either, because we didn't change, is there something that happened during that period of time that spurred the change in other states?
So Massachusetts, for example, part of why the fort has come from Massachusetts to Wisconsin is that what they did is they said, rather than have this big fight about the reading wars, again, let's get together authoritative bodies and decide what the science says. And then let's create a test that reflects best practices. And then let's make sure that our college programs prepare people to pass that test. So in the same way that when Julie did her medical boards, we say there is knowledge in medicine. Sometimes it changes. Sometimes we have new discoveries. Let's make sure that physicians can treat patients. But there was so in Wisconsin, though, there has been a reluctance to change. So other states have moved beyond us because they have done a better job, and we frankly haven't. We have not progressed. So we've stayed at the same level while the rest of a great many states have moved forward.
Was there something that happened? And so you're saying these other states have followed the science better
Yes,
than we have?
yes.
I have a comment. I just recently, well, not recently, but in 2013 completed my reading teacher licensure and through UW Stout, and I will testify that I was given a reading recovery basically program. So I spent 2 years just learning to do reading recovery. As a reading specialist then, that was the tools that I was taught to use, is let's guess at the word. In fact, I had the bookmark that was given to us was the very first one, do not sound out the word, just as you said. And so I will verify what you are saying is true. And we are producing hundreds and hundreds of reading teachers in the state of Wisconsin that's all they know because that's what they've been taught in this day and age.
And we're doing a great disservice to people who then go through those programs. So I've talked to people who were told, oh, here are some articles they should quickly try to study for the fort after the program was over. So our hope had been, and still is, that how do we change the pedagogical norm? But we have a long way to go. And there are things about academic freedom. There are people who are passionate about what they do. But those people should be held to account in using the best science as well. And they should be preparing their students to pass a meaningful test that will prepare them to help their students.
I have a comment about that. Not only all teachers, or at least all elementary teachers up through 5th grade, but maybe some administrators. Because in science, we know that the fidelity and validity of anything depends first on the bedrock of knowledge. And I have tutored teachers to pass the fort, which is a big problem because they really don't have the bedrock of knowledge. And a well-trained teacher in your classroom will help those mildly disabled or dyslexic children so much more. As you said, that structured literacy is just good education for all. It's good reading and instruction, it's good spelling instruction. And I think perhaps what happened was going to whole language instruction without that. About 80% of our students will learn to read with some sort of reading instruction. They will. The 20% that don't, though, they won't learn without the kind of instruction that you're talking about, the structured literacy. They simply won't. So you can't do more whole language in a small group or more minutes per week. You have to very much change the reading instruction. But if we just gave all of our kids structured literacy, we would probably do much better all the way across the board.
One of the things I'd like to stress in states like Massachusetts, Florida, which were noted in the graphs, Delaware, some other states, the schools that are on U.S. military bases, places that have made really dramatic gains in reading, all of those gains were designed, all of those program shifts were designed to raise the kids at the bottom. That was the original plan. That's why they did it. It was designed to raise the kids at the bottom. In every one of those places, they were stunned when their test results came back and the percentage of kids at the top, that top sliver of performers, doubled. In Massachusetts, the number of kids reading at the advanced level doubled. In Florida, it doubled. In Delaware, it doubled. On the defense bases, it doubled. Nobody was trying to double those. And that really was a remarkable insight to find out that. So I work with kids with tremendous difficulties across a wide range of their life. I can't think of anything else you can do that literally helps everybody. The thing that's best for the kids at the bottom is also best for the kids at the top. Maybe a healthy diet. That's about the only one. This is really very analogous to the notion of a healthy diet. So everybody benefits from it. Some kids desperately need it.
There are a number of school districts in the state that are doing a wonderful job with this instruction. They're using Wilson Reading. They're combining that with RTI. They're using PALS and a variety of other assessment tools. They're developing individual plans for children who are struggling in literacy, and that goes all the way through 12th grade. I'm wondering if maybe the committee would consider having one or two of those school districts join us and share with us what they're doing and what their successes are. I also liken this to the state legislators' career planning effort. We've developed pilot programs, 21 of them across the state, to develop a career planning effort for our students, required to be implemented a couple of years ago, and we're seeing significant results from planning and helping our kids prepare for careers. So back to your original question, there are some examples of legislation that the legislature has put together that has been successful to increase the success of our kids across the state.
And certainly the process for getting on as a potential presenter in the future, you can reach out to my office if I'd prefer recommendations from, someone who's on the committee as to, hey, these are successful, so, and then we can consider those, so. Yes, Brenda Warren.
Just in anticipation of you answering Representative Culp's question, what I see is two problems that need to be fixed. One is the screening, identification, and education of students who are with dyslexia, and the other is how we bring our teachers up to speed in terms of being able to prepare them to teach well. So I'd love for you, when you answer the question about legislation, to look at those two pieces, because it seems to me if we overemphasize one over the other, we're still going to have a problem. We'll either not identify students and have well-trained teachers, or we'll have lots of students identified and teachers that aren't prepared to teach them.
And this specifically was the aspiration of Act 166, not that it was going to be an end-all, but that it was a starting point of some things that needed to be done. That the hope with FORT was, so there are rules about licensure that there's not double jeopardy, that you have a license and it's taken away if you don't demonstrate a skill, but we can work on front-end loading, for people having skills that they need to teach exceptionally well, and then to do more with screening. But it is a beginning point. Do you want to address Representative Colts? So you're, I don't mean to, you know, so I think the question is a great question, and I would go back in part to where the conversation started in 2009 with Bill, you know, was it 584 that died in committee, which is we've got inexpensive, fast ways to be screening for the skills that are highly predictive of who's going to have trouble. And it's phonemic awareness, it's things like pseudo-word decoding, it's rapid naming, it's vocabulary.
And there are, just to insert there are more than one organization, there is more than one organization that would do that. So in, you know, in legislation, it's difficult to write something that's proprietary because of course then it excludes all others. But there's a scientific base and a broad bunch of vendors.
A lot of vendors and potentially done with less expense than was PALS. So the challenge with PALS is that it's a benchmark test. It has moved the bar up, by the way. So PALS was a meaningful step. And now that a provision is that schools now are able to take some of their PALS money and spend it on other things. Some are doing the good STAR test. Some are spending the money on the STAR test that has phonics removed. So the problem with the benchmark tests, as one school psychologist told me, he said, well, you need to be prepared for the fact that there's a very low floor. So you have to have a lot of trouble before you're going to have trouble on PALS. And so, and families don't understand that. So one of the things that we talked about in that original 2009 legislation was to make sure that things were normative and understandable. So things should be reported in percentiles. We can educate people about what a percentile means in terms of saying, okay, if you're at the 16th percentile, your child, then 84 out of every 100 kids is ahead of you at that same grade. We could do something to just help people to understand that, and then parents would passionately advocate for their kids. They would know. And so that was one of the provisions. We said, make sure that it's fast, clear, scientifically predictive. We've got the measures out there. Let's give the information to families in terms that they can understand. But then we also said, let's make sure that schools have to share that information. So we sometimes have one school district, Monona Grove, that's doing a much better job than another right next door, Madison. And so let's think about those school districts, you know, as you were saying, Mr. Weber, about the ones that are doing really well. Why are they doing really well? That data should be out there, should be publicly available, so that would change what is normative. One last thing, DPI has been relentlessly focused on local control. The response to RTI, when we were talking with DPI about how RTI was implemented, is it was all about, well, individual schools are going to do RTI their way. So rather than having leadership that said, let's look at how, like Minnesota did, let's really look at how RTI could be utilized and people could be instructed to succeed as teachers in this method. Instead, we've had this massively disparate number of approaches. And that is just hugely inappropriate. We would never say this in medicine. We would never say, hey, why don't you all go and do all these different things and we'll see which patients survive, right? This is not okay, what we're doing.
If I can, I'd like to bring the committee's attention, picking up on what Mr. Weber said, which I think is an excellent idea, to look for some districts that are doing a better job and hear about their experiences. That Wisconsin statutes currently require DPI to collect on an annual basis a report from every district as to how they teach reading, their philosophies of reading, the materials they use, the textbooks and curriculum materials they use. For over a decade, DPI has not collected that information. If we had that information, we would be ahead in trying to look. We could compare that to other achievement data, and we would know more about what's working in Wisconsin. It'd be interesting. DPI, I know they don't collect it because I ask for it on an annual basis, and they tell me they don't have it. So one of the things I would ask for is that we inquire of DPI either here or, you know, by some other formal means, to explain to us why they don't collect that and what it would take to get them to do it.
Interesting. Go ahead.
I know that 3 years ago, DPI did get together with districts that were identified as having special ed students being exceeding, because Northland Pines School District was identified as one of those schools, and they met probably 5 times, and there was no follow-through on the paperwork. We don't know what happened to that information, because one of my colleagues was actually on that committee. So I know something was done with DPI, but I don't know what happened to that information.
Interesting. Go ahead,
I'm going to
Dr.
comment
Lizzie.
that I tried to just quickly look at the data for the Wisconsin Fort results, and that's not easy to find either. I don't know, that was part of it, it was supposed to be published that colleges would tell how well their teachers are doing in passing that reading, that foundations of reading test is what Fort means. And it's so that even teachers or future teachers looking at colleges could understand which schools are doing a good job of helping their students learn that material, and I think that's not very easy to find.
The law says they're supposed to publish the data. The law failed to say they're supposed to publish it annually, and so when they publish it, it's 4 or 5 years old, which meets the law.
Yeah. There was a comment about the timing when is the PAL screening done? Is that at the end of the school year?
No, so I was referencing some of the No Child Left Behind tests.
Okay,
So not
understood.
specifically PALS, so like the new, so forward, and sometimes they're given at different times of the year, but a lot of the tests are not informing instruction.
Mm-hmm.
They're given at the end of the year to say, how well did the school do?
Mm-hmm.
But again, these are expensive, they're not sensitive to reading problems, they're not guiding how to help kids.
So the Act 166, I think it was that said that screening needed to be done. Did that specify a time of the year that needed to be done as well?
Kindergarten, I'm not sure. I'm not
And
sure.
I don't know,
Yeah.
it did not. Okay, Legislative Council says it did not. So would that be something that would be important to have as potential legislation to move that to a specific time so that it could inform, or, asking teachers here, is there a carryover from year to year? I mean, at the end of the year, if a screening is done, does that information all get dropped on to the next teacher at the next school year?
Sometimes,
Okay, so there would be a potential gap there.
yes.
So,
Yeah. Well, and let's catch people before they fall. And so the hope of PALS, initially, again, PALS is not a great measure. We can do far better, less expensive, more scientifically based, guiding instruction to a greater degree, faster. But the hope is, let's find these kids early, let's intervene early.
speaking as a legislator, less expensive, faster, and scientific those are really good words, so.
Right.
I should say, too, that some of the best screeners allow tremendous flexibility, so that if you've screened a child at the beginning of kindergarten, at the end of kindergarten, at the beginning of first grade, and they're stellar, and a number of kids are, you don't have to screen them as often as the other kids. They can fall off the list. It's one of the ways that you can save time and money that you can use with other kids. So not this kind of overly prescriptive, in the first week of September, doggone it, we're going to screen every kid in the state no matter what, up to the age of 12. And, we just don't need to do that. But we can't put in so much flexibility that people leave kids off who should be screened more often.
Excellent. Go ahead.
We could screen all day long, but unless the receiving teachers know what to do, they will not be successful with their students. And in terms of the Fort, I took that test 2 years ago. I passed that test because I've been trained. I've been trained in Norton Gillingham and in Wilson. I know what to do with kids that are struggling. There are hundreds, I will repeat my statement, there are hundreds of teachers who are trying to pass the Fort. I personally know of one who took 6 times to pass the test. Tell me that teacher knows what to do when she gets to the classroom. She does not.
I'm very aware of the fact that it is 10 after 12, but Dr. Gosey, I think you have a final comment.
I do. As far as legislation, as a physician, there's an opioid crisis, so Wisconsin enacted a law that I'm required to keep my license. Once every 2 years, I take an opioid an evidence-based, approved by the state opioid-type training course. 2 hours, it can be online, in person. It's not that expensive, but as a pediatrician, I don't prescribe a lot of opioids, but I still had to do it because everyone needs to understand what the problems are and how to be safe about it. And I think something like that might be considered as far as teacher training, that there is something required to maintain licensure, not just the new teachers, but make sure everybody gets some professional development, whether it passes a test or not, but actually that would be, approved by the state, that definitely includes the content that we're talking about. Again, it really, I don't know that it was crucial for me as a pediatrician to have it, but after I did it, it was a good thing that I think it makes sense that everybody needs to do it. And I would say we have an education crisis, a reading crisis, and so it doesn't seem out of line to think that requiring every single teacher, I don't know how often you relicense, but,
Not anymore.
That's the problem.
We have no licensure problems anymore. We're good to go our whole lives.
Right.
okay, so, see, I learned something. So that seems like not the best way to keep going, to address your concern that we can screen all day, but if teachers don't have ongoing, because things change.
Exactly. And onto that concept, it's not just the teachers who need to be trained, our administrators need to be trained, because if they don't know what to be looking for in their classrooms, the point is mute. So there's really good, other states have done it. Mississippi has done a good model. Colorado has done a good model of getting kids, getting administrators trained in the science of reading.
Again, we've got some excellent examples of school districts that have cranked up their professional development because of the licensure. So to assume that since there's no more requirements, that school districts something's happening, and I can't, so I know that school districts have beefed up professional development because of that licensure issue. I also know there are many school districts that require the similar kind of training of all of their principals as they do the teachers, so they can do exactly what you're suggesting, is that when they walk in the classroom, they know what they're looking at and what they should be evaluating.
My faith in legislative council has just been upped because they have put together an awesome committee with the ability to speak from different angles. So that's a good thing. And we'll bring it back up at 1 p.m. If you care to join us after lunch, do that. In the meantime, thank you very much for your testimony this morning.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.